you said that you accepted the Quran being something special, being from God, even before that, before you sitting in the car and your friend talking to you. We want to know what caused that to happen.
Yeah, well, because it was for me, it was just a rational framework. In actual fact, many people won't believe this, but it was to do with the linguistic inimitability of the Quranic discourse. But in what way? I heard a basic structure of an argument that if some of the historical premises were true, then the conclusion was likely to be very true. And what it was about the Prophet ﷺ, being a vehicle to revelation, the eternal word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he came to the Arabs in the 7th century and he challenged their fundamental worldview, right? They challenged their fundamental worldview that had real world implications. And the Quran was the main miracle. And the Quran was bold. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 23, for example, Allah said, produce one chapter like it. And the interesting thing is, when you look at the history based on Western and Muslim and Eastern academics, there is a consensus that the Arabs in the 7th century Arabia were the best at expressing themselves in the Arabic tongue. Like, it was the peak of eloquence, if you like. It was like the Shakespearean period for the Arab world. And, I think Ibn Rashid is a literary historian, Arab literary historian. He mentions that the Arabs would only celebrate two things: when there was like a birth of a child, or when a poet rose amongst them. Because being a poet, it's not like being a poet today, right? You write a book and it gets read by one person or 1.5 people, right? But being a poet at that time, to be a master, you would have to go out of the city and study for like 10 years. It's like equivalent of getting a PhD, right? 3-year degree, 1-year master, and then 3-year or 4 years PhD. Actually, more than that. It's like doing a postdoctorate, yeah? Because that would be around 10 years. So, they were like the equivalent postdoctorate researchers in poetry and eloquence. And not only that, it had a social and political implication.
I was going to say that even getting a PhD today it's not that big of a deal. Back then, if you were a very influential poet, you're not only ruining the lives of people, you have the ability to ruin the lives of people. You have the ability to ruin tribes. And one example is Banu Numayr had to change their tribe name to Banu Amr because of who was it? Jarir, because of Jarir's poetry. So subhanallah, like, imagine that you had to change your tribe's name because of poetry.
Absolutely. Yeah. Not just that, Sheikh, as you know, poets could start wars and they could end wars practically. Right? It was like the media of today, if you like, which has huge power, because media, as you know, can start wars and end wars, right? They can support genocides or help end genocides. So this is the reality of the media. So there are so many aspects that we can unpack here, but the important thing is that the poets had that kind of status now, that maqam. So
I just want to point out that, I don't, have you ever said, like, because your answer to that question about the inimitability of the Quran, have you ever said that before, that being one of the catalysts of your acceptance of Islam?
I read it very rarely, because it was part of my kind of intellectual journey, because I ended up writing an essay, which is part of my book,
right.
God's Testimony, which uses the structure of the argument but unpacks it further.
Right.
It's always been something that I've been connected to, always.
That's what we've all been waiting for. That we've been wanting you to say that, but sometimes you've mentioned the gradual process and focus on that instead.
Yeah, for sure. So, from the Quranic perspective, So going back to the inimitability stuff, so the poets at the time of the Prophet ﷺ were like, had a huge status. Now, the Prophet comes with the Quran and announces Tawheed, affirms the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As you know, ibadah means, according to Ibn Kathir and Ibn Taymiyyah and others, the peak of love and the peak of submission, and acts that express that love and submission. Yeah. So the Prophet came to teach people Tawheed. Who is Allah? The oneness of Allah, His names and attributes, affirm His perfection, affirm His oneness, affirm that He is the King of all kings, affirm His unique oneness. He is Ahad, uniquely one, and so on and so forth. That we must direct and single out all acts of worship, the internal acts and the external acts of worship, to Allah alone. And the Quran came, challenges the whole worldview, because as you know, their worldview was based on polytheism and shirk, and it was connected to economics and politics and trade and all of that stuff. The Quran comes, the Prophet ﷺ, and just undermines that, just pulls the kind of worldview paradigm rug beneath them, right? And the Quran challenges them and says, okay, well, just produce one chapter like it. Now, for me, I mean, I don't want this to be related to this argument per se. You know, they could go to my website or go to my book and read the particular chapter that unpacks this argument. But for me, I just find it absolutely phenomenal, because actually, let me just quote you something that I've written, right?
Yeah.
A powerful argument that supports this assertion that the 7th century Arabs failed to imitate the Quran relates to the social political circumstances of the time. Central to the Quranic message was the condemnation of the immoral, unjust, and evil practices of the 7th century Meccan tribes. These included the objectification of women, unjust trade, polytheism, slavery, hoarding of wealth, infanticide, and the shunning of orphans. The Meccan leadership was being challenged by the Quranic message, and this had the potential to undermine their leadership and economic success. In order for Islam to stop spreading, all that was needed for the Prophet's adversaries was to meet the linguistic and literary challenge of the Quran. However, the fact that Islam succeeded in its early, fragile days in Mecca testifies to the fact that its primary audience was not all able to meet the Quranic challenge. No movement can succeed if a fundamental claim to its core is explicitly proven false. The fact that the Meccan leadership had to resort to extreme campaigns, such as warfare and torture, to attempt to extinguish Islam, demonstrates that the easy method of refuting Islam, meeting the Quranic challenge, failed. So if the best Arabs were best placed to challenge the Quran failed, then it can't come from a non-Arab. And we know it couldn't come from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ for many reasons, because he, number one, he was an Arab too. And he was not known to actually study and cultivate any special rhetorical skills, although we know he had concise speech. Yeah. And therefore, the best inference to the best explanation is that it came from the divine. Couldn't come from an Arab, couldn't come from a non-Arab, couldn't come from the Prophet ﷺ, therefore it came from the divine. Now there's much more kind of intellectual arguments and nuances and premises, but we don't have to discuss that. But that for me was extremely powerful. I was like, there's no other explanation. And what's even more beautiful is when you start to learn a little bit of Arabic and you start going into the Quran, you're like, oh my God, this is something else. Which I'm very humbled that you actually cited one of my essays in the book, which I didn't know about, by the way. I had no idea about. So when I was going through it, I was like, oh my God, he cited me. And lo and behold, we're actually talking about this very same topic. But when you go through the Quran and you start exploring these things, you're like, wow, there's something amazing here. And the chapter that you cite, and it's quite interesting, you say in the book that some people have tried to articulate this in the English language, but it doesn't even touch what you can refer to or understand in the Arabic language, which I totally agree. But take, for example, Surah Al-Kawthar, and it's summarized in just the first kind of paragraph or so in another article about Produce One Chapter Like It, which is available on Sapiens Institute website. When you go into the kind of empirical data now and you start assessing it, you're like, wow, this is just too much. For example, if you don't mind, I'll just read the introduction.
Please.
Here is a challenge. Take 10 words in any language, formulated into 3 lines or verses, and add any preposition or linguistic particle you see fit. Produce at least 27 rhetorical devices and literary features. At the same time, ensure it has a unique structure, is timelessly meaningful, and relates to themes within a book that it is part of, the size of which is over 70,000 words. Make sure 4 of its words are unique and never used again in the book. Ensure each line or verse ends with a rhyme, created by words with the most optimal meanings. Make sure that these words are used only once in the 3 lines and not used anywhere else in the book. Ensure that the 3 lines concisely and eloquently semantically mirror the chapter before it, and they must formulate a profound response to an unplanned set of circumstances. You must use 10 letters in each line and 10 letters only once in the entire 3 lines. Throughout the whole piece, make sure you produce a semantically orientated rhythm without sacrificing any meaning. Do all of the above publicly in one attempt without revision or amendment, in absence of any formal training in eloquence and rhetoric. Impossible as the above may seem, this is exactly what the Quran achieved in its shortest chapter, Al-Kawthar, the abundance, and it was expressed through the Prophet ﷺ, who was not known to have composed any poetry, nor cultivated any special rhetorical gifts. And the rest of the essay unpacks the kind of quasi-academic nature of each point that was mentioned in the introduction. Now, the reason I've combined these 2 things together, because I still feel, even if someone is not best equipped to make the assessment about the Quran because they don't have the tools, and even when you know Arabic, you still won't have the tools anyway, because it's a very specialized system, if you like balagha, eloquence, and rhetoric is a very specialized subset of classical Arabic grammar, and you have to master it for 10 years plus. You may be able to taste it with some Arabic, but the point is, even if you don't know the language at all, these 2 things, combining these 2 things, should be enough to create an aha moment, especially the first one, which is about, could it be from an Arab, could it be from a non-Arab, could it be from the Prophet ﷺ? And when you look at all the kind of historical evidences without needing to know any letter of the Arabic language, that's why I wrote the essay, so you don't have to know anything about Arabic, just based on an inference to the best explanation and the testimonial data that we have, which is a valid source of knowledge, and it's indispensable, the epistemology of testimony, even in Eastern and Western scholarship, but we don't have to discuss that right now. But the point is, when you access that stuff, and I'll put the links in the description, it could still be enough. So anyway, enough of me, ya Sheikh, enough of me. I have 8 questions for you, subhanAllah. I want you to talk now, no more talking from me, because sometimes I get complaints, Hamza, you interrupt a lot.
We're enjoying it. We're enjoying it, yes, Dad.
Yeah, because it's it's the Greek in me coming out. So, Bismillah.